Medieval cities were filthy and dangerous places to live. You'd be hard-pressed to find a more unpleasant living environment than the typical medieval city. There was human waste in the streets, houses collapsed all the time, deadly diseases ran rampant, and there wasn't even a fire department. Fires broke out regularly, consuming entire city blocks in some cases. And the sanitation situation was so bad that people would get sick from just walking down the street. There are over 300 cities still standing in Europe today that have kept their medieval architecture. And while they might look pretty and charming now, it's important to remember that these buildings are hundreds of years old. Much has changed since then, and these cities can teach us a lot about what life was like back then. We already made a video about how dirty and disgusting medieval castles were, so click here to check it out. But for now, let's talk about how filthy and frightening medieval cities really were. Welcome to my channel. Viewer discretion is advised for this video, as some of this video may be offensive or disturbing. We, the makers of this video, in no way support or condone the actions of the subjects featured. Let's start off with the obvious, the streets. Back then, they didn't have things like garbage trucks or recycling bins. People would throw their trash out into the streets where it would pile up. Along with the trash, people would also throw out their chamber pots, which were containers used for toilets. This meant that people had to literally walk through piles of poop and urine on their way to work or to a friend's house. To make matters worse, the people who lived in the cities weren't exactly the cleanest. They rarely washed themselves and their clothes were seldom cleaned. If someone wanted to open a shop, they could do so by simply hanging out a shingle. There was no need for a permit or license, which meant that many people without any kind of training could hang out a shingle and call themselves, say, a barber. But this also meant that butchers could hang out their shingles right next to bakers, and you can probably imagine what a butcher shop smelled like. The mix of human waste, spoiled food, and dead animals meant that the streets were absolutely reeking at all times. To add another layer to this gross situation, stray dogs and other animals would go through the trash, making the streets even dirtier. While we're on the subject of the streets, let's talk about how often they caught on fire. Medieval buildings were made mostly from wood. This was not only because wood was cheap and easy to come by, but it was also seen as a status symbol. Wealthy people would build large, tall wooden structures to show off their wealth. In Venice, Italy, there were several instances where an entire district was burnt to the ground. On July 14, 1577, a fire broke out in a shop on the Grand Canal. The fire spread quickly and soon engulfed the entire district. It took 4 long days to put the fire out, and when it was finally extinguished, thousands of people were left homeless. Another devastating fire swept through Venice in 1483. That one was so intense that it lit up the night sky, causing people to mistake it for fireworks. When something like this happened, the citizens would sound an alarm. People would grab whatever belongings they could and flee the city to avoid being burned alive or suffocating from smoke. But even if a person managed to escape a fire, they could easily die from a different danger, the plague. There were many different plagues that swept through Europe during the Middle Ages, but the most well-known is the Black Death. It's believed that around 25 million people died from the plague, which was around 30 to 50% of the population. Most of those who died were from the cities. Before modern medicine, disease would spread very quickly in the cities. The main reason for this is that most people lived in extreme poverty. Poor people lived in absolutely disgusting conditions, and it didn't take much for them to catch something. As soon as one person got sick, it would spread like wildfire through the community. If that wasn't bad enough, the cures for the diseases were sometimes worse than the diseases themselves. For example, mercury was used to treat syphilis. People would cover themselves in mercury and scrape it off to remove the disease. The problem was that mercury is toxic and would often kill those trying to cure themselves. Another thing that killed many people in the Middle Ages was crime. Murder was very common back then. One of the worst things about the crime rate back then was that the police force, if there even was one, would rarely intervene. It was uncommon for people to take the law into their own hands and commit crimes like robbery and murder. And when this happened, it was likely that the perpetrator would never face justice. This led to an increase in violence as people became more desperate. Entire guilds or groups of people would band together to protect themselves from criminals. During the late Middle Ages, there were riots on the streets almost every year. These riots were usually started by poor people who were tired of being exploited. Sometimes the riots would get so violent that whole districts of the city would be destroyed. Looting was also very common. When a wealthy merchant passed away, his family would board up their house and try to leave the city. However, the journey to the next town was long and dangerous, so they would hire guards to protect them along the way. If there were no guards to protect the family, then the townspeople would often do the job for them. They would essentially act as a funeral procession, protecting the family until they reached the next town. But sometimes the townspeople would get a little too excited and end up looting the deceased's house. In England in the year 1181, a heavy tax was imposed on the English citizens. The citizens were so upset that they rebelled against the king. The rebels roamed the streets, pillaging on anything they could find. The king sent his soldiers after them, but they were no match for the mob. It took 3 full days for the king's army to regain control of the city. Not only did people have to worry about being robbed or murdered on the streets, but they also had to watch out for their houses. Houses in the Middle Ages were made mainly from wood. Earthquakes and storms were common, and it wasn't rare for a house to collapse. Sometimes it wasn't natural disasters that destroyed the houses, but rather people. In 1325, a group of English peasants revolted against their king. The peasants demanded lower taxes and better treatment. When the king refused, the peasants began attacking the homes of the rich. They went through the streets, smashing windows, tearing down walls, and burning crops. The peasants were eventually defeated, but not before leaving the English countryside in ruins. The streets were also extremely dangerous for children. Back then, there were no parks or playgrounds for kids to play in. It was common for children to beg on the streets to help support their families. Many of them would go blind or lame begging. For food and money, children would walk around carrying out the sewage in buckets. At first, this job seemed safe enough, but the bucket was often filled with urine and human waste, and if the child wasn't careful, he or she could fall and be covered in feces. To make matters worse, children would carry the buckets on their heads. If they lost their balance and fell, the contents of the bucket would spill onto their heads, covering them in waste. It's clear that life in a medieval city was terrible. Disease ran rampant. Houses collapsed all the time, and people were in danger of being robbed or murdered. The fact that there was human waste and urine on the streets at all times just added to the filth and stench of it all. So count yourself lucky, you never lived in a medieval city. Now it's time to make your voice heard. A rebellion against an oppressive king resulted in the death of one of the most iconic rebels in English history. And if you'd like to know more about this incredible story, then keep watching, because this is the rise and fall of Wat Tyler. In 1348, Wat Tyler was just an ordinary English peasant farmer trying to make his way in the world. But that all changed when he got caught up in the peasants' revolt. This rebellion saw the English peasants take arms against their king, Edward III. The revolt started with the Black Death pandemic, which killed around half of England's population between 1346 and 1353. The Black Death had a massive impact on the country and its people, but it didn't kill everyone. However, it did have an impact on those that survived. Because of the lack of available workers, wages increased dramatically, meaning that the peasants were able to earn more money than ever before. Sadly though, after the plague, these higher wages were taxed by the crown, leaving the peasants worse off than they were before the plague. This was the first straw to break the camel's back for Wat Tyler. While Wat Tyler might not have been an important noble or influential landowner, he was still impacted by the decisions of the king and the taxes imposed on him and his fellow villagers. To add insult to injury, the English nobility came up with a new set of laws known as the Statutes of Labourers, which aimed to fix wages at pre-plague levels. This meant that any extra money that the peasants had earned during the plague could be taken away from them by their landlords, something which didn't go down well with the English peasantry. For the first time in their lives, they had tasted freedom through earning more money, and they weren't going to let it slip through their fingers. It seemed like Wat Tyler and many other peasants felt the same way, too. And when he heard about a plan to increase taxes further, he decided that enough was enough. In May 1381, Wat Tyler led a group of peasants in an attack on the manor house of Sir Hugh Croft, a local lord who had benefited greatly from the higher rents he received from the peasants. His fellow villagers, outraged at the oppression under the nobility and the crown, supported Wat Tyler in his endeavors. And soon he found himself leading a rebellion against the English monarchy itself. On June 1381, Wat Tyler led an army of peasants into London, where he demanded that King Edward III meet with him to discuss the grievances of the people. The king agreed and invited Wat Tyler and his men to the Tower of London to discuss peace. After some negotiation, it seemed like an agreement had been reached and Wat Tyler and his men were allowed to leave the tower peacefully. But once they were outside, the soldiers guarding the tower opened fire on the unsuspecting peasants, killing many of them. Realizing what had happened, the remaining peasants fought back and took several soldiers hostage, including the young Prince of Wales. It seemed like the peasants were winning. But things were soon to change when another rebel leader stepped forward. John Bull, an English cleric, became one of the main leaders of the revolt and helped negotiate with the king. He managed to convince the king to abolish serfdom in England, which would have made him very popular amongst the peasants. But he wasn't so popular with the other rebel leaders, particularly Wat Tyler. There are two versions of what happened next. One version claims that John Bull was actually arrested and executed for treason, while the other says that he fled to France. But we don't know which one is true because records from the time period are incomplete. However, both accounts agree on one thing: Wat Tyler's demise. With the departure of John Bull, Wat Tyler became the de facto leader of the peasants. But this didn't last long because shortly after taking Prince Edward hostage, he was invited to meet with the king. Once again, Wat Tyler and his men entered the Tower of London expecting a peaceful discussion. But once again, they were met with violence. This time, however, it wasn't the soldiers who fired on the peasants. Instead, it was Wat Tyler himself. In a moment of anger, he drew his dagger and attacked the royal official Sir Simon Burley. Unfortunately for him, he was a little off target and ended up stabbing a young courtier named Thomas Poe, fatally wounding him. This sudden outburst of violence immediately turned the people against Wat Tyler, and he was swiftly arrested and taken to Smithfield Market, where he was hanged for his crime. And this marked the end of the Peasants' Revolt and the death of one of England's greatest heroes. Wat Tyler may have been an ordinary peasant, but his actions during the Peasants' Revolt had far-reaching consequences. His legacy lived on long after his death and inspired future generations of rebels to fight for justice. He has been immortalized in books, films, and TV shows, including Guy of Gisborne's famous portrayal of him in the BBC series Robin Hood. After Wat Tyler's death, King Edward III had to deal with the fallout of the revolt. He went back on his word and did not abolish the oppressive laws that had sparked the rebellion in the first place. Instead, he cracked down on the peasants, punishing them for their involvement in the revolt. Many of the rebel leaders were executed, and the survivors faced imprisonment and heavy fines. Despite the brutal crackdown, the Peasants' Revolt is remembered as one of the most significant moments in English history. It showed the power of the people and their ability to fight back against oppressive rule. Although the revolt ultimately failed, it left a lasting impact on the English monarchy and paved the way for future reforms. The story of Wat Tyler, the commoner who led the Peasants' Revolt, has captured the imaginations of many throughout history. His bravery and determination in the face of tyranny are truly inspiring, even though he might have lost his life in the struggle for justice. His legacy lives on in the hearts and minds of those who fight for equality and freedom. In July of 1518, a woman named Frau Troffea began dancing uncontrollably in the streets of Strasbourg. She danced for days without stopping, and when she finally collapsed from exhaustion, she was replaced by another dancer, then another and another, until soon the entire town was infected with an insatiable urge to dance. But why? Welcome back everyone to my channel. Today we're going to look at the mystery of the dancing plague, which caused hundreds of people to dance themselves to death. And if that sounds like something out of a creepy Stephen King novel, just wait until you hear what happened next. The year is 1518 and Frau Troffea, a middle-class housewife living in the town of Strasbourg, is having a perfectly normal day. That all changes when she begins experiencing strange symptoms. First, there's a general feeling of uneasiness followed by an uncontrollable urge to dance, and before she knows it, she's thrown into a fit of dancing that lasts for days. When she's not dancing, Troffea is sleeping, and when she wakes up, she's racked with pain. Her heart is racing and her limbs feel heavy, and the only thing that will stop the shaking in her legs is more dancing. This goes on for a whole week, and after collapsing from exhaustion, Troffea is taken to a hospital where she dies. But here's the disturbing part. As Troffea lies dying in the hospital, she's surrounded by other patients who are in the same condition. They, too, have been stricken with the uncontrollable urge to dance. In fact, there were so many of them that they had to be moved into a separate building, which was filled to capacity within a few hours. Meanwhile, Troffea's grave is hastily dug and covered over so that nobody gets any ideas. You see, while she may have died, the plague is far from over. In fact, things are about to get much worse. Back in the hospital, one patient is cured and leaves the building. But as soon as he steps outside, he breaks into a cold sweat and falls down dead. Soon after, 2 more patients die, then 13 more, and then 20. It seems like every time a patient is cured, they're immediately met with death, either in the street or back inside the hospital. As this is happening, more and more people are showing up at the hospital, begging to be admitted because they, too, feel the overwhelming need to dance. At first, the hospital staff refuses them entry, but soon they're overwhelmed and can't turn anyone away. By the end of July, the hospital is filled to the brim with dancers who are too exhausted to continue dancing, but also don't want to stop dancing. The staff doesn't know what to do. There isn't enough food or water to go around, and those who leave the building to get some die almost immediately. Those who stay behind eventually die from exhaustion or starvation. So how did this happen? Well, there's a lot of theories, but no one knows for sure. Let's take a look at the most popular ones. Mass psychogenic illness. In psychology, mass psychogenic illness refers to a situation where a person experiences physical symptoms that are not explained by any medical condition, and those symptoms often have a psychological explanation. For example, in 2016, several high school girls began showing up to school with unexplained injuries such as black eyes and cuts. After speaking with the students, their teachers realized that they were all making these injuries happen to themselves, and it was all because of peer pressure. The same thing happened in 1970 when a group of schoolgirls began falling into fits of screaming. Even though they didn't know it at the time, they were suffering from a collective hysteria outbreak, and this could very well be what happened in Strasbourg. Experts believe that the dancing mania could have started with Frau Troffea, who might have suffered from a psychological illness. If so, seeing her dance uncontrollably could have triggered the same symptoms in other people. And since no one understood what was happening, it would have created a panic. People would have been scared, confused, and desperate to find a solution. And since dancing was the only known remedy, everyone would have danced until they died. Some researchers even believe that this could have been a religious experience, similar to a cult. And since people believed that they were possessed by the devil, dancing would have been the best way to fight off the demon inside of them. Ergot poisoning. Ergot poisoning is a disease that's caused by a fungus called ergot. The disease causes convulsions, hallucinations, and uncontrollable urges to move. It's possible that Frau Trophia ate bread that contained ergot, causing her to become the first dancer. But if that's true, it doesn't explain why so many people became infected after eating the same bread. Rabies. Rabies is a viral disease that affects the central nervous system. Symptoms include fever, anxiety, paralysis, and convulsions. While rabies does cause the infected person to foam at the mouth and act violently, it does not cause them to dance. And there's no evidence that any of the dancers were foaming at the mouth. Mass hysteria. Mass hysteria is an extremely rare condition in which a person exhibits physical symptoms that cannot be explained medically. The symptoms usually start in a group of people who are under extreme stress, and the symptoms spread to others through social suggestion. And that's what likely happened during the dancing plague. Experts say that the best explanation for the dancing plague is mass hysteria. Back in 1518, Strasbourg was a city under siege. It was being attacked by outside forces and the citizens were terrified. Frau Trophia may have felt this stress and developed the symptoms herself, but when she began dancing uncontrollably, it would have spread to others. Each time someone new developed symptoms, the fear would have spread throughout the town like wildfire, resulting in hundreds of people dancing themselves to death. But this begs the question, why did the people of Strasbourg succumb to mass hysteria? Well, for starters, they were under a lot of stress. As I mentioned, the town was being attacked and famine was spreading throughout Europe. Plus, life was hard back then. Medical care was non-existent, disease was rampant, and if you weren't careful, you could die from pretty much anything. So it's understandable that the people of Strasbourg would have been extremely stressed. Plus, back in 1518, there was no real understanding of mental illness. People didn't understand what was happening to them or why, so they probably turned to dancing as a form of coping. It also didn't help that they were in a religious community. Remember, dancing was seen as a way to fight off the devil, and if you believed that you were possessed by the devil, dancing would have been your only option. Lastly, it's important to remember that the people of Strasbourg were not alone. This was not just a case of mass hysteria where a small group of people fell victim to it. This was a case where hundreds of people lost their lives. And when you think about it, that makes the dancing plague all the more terrifying. Imagine walking down the street and seeing hundreds of people lying on the ground, dancing uncontrollably. Imagine watching these people dance for days on end until they collapse from exhaustion or starvation. And imagine knowing that if you tried to stop them, you could save their lives. What made this situation even worse was that there was no cure for the dancing plague. None of the treatments worked, and eventually the only option left was to let them dance until they died. The legacy of the dancing plague. After the plague hit Strasbourg, similar outbreaks occurred throughout Europe. In total, it's believed that 400 people lost their lives due to the dancing plague. But the worst part is that no one really knows what caused it. There are lots of theories out there, but nothing has ever been proven. Some people believe it was mass hysteria, others believe it was ergot poisoning. But no one really knows. I hope you enjoyed learning about the mystery of the dancing plague. If you did, please hit the like button. Thank you for watching and come back soon. Who doesn't love a good palace tour? Get a glimpse of life in the opulent Lord Mayor's mansion in 18th century London. The year is 1739 and you are standing outside the grand entrance to the Lord Mayor's mansion on the corner of Cheapside and Old Jewry in London. The mansion is the home of Sir John Trevor and his wife, Lady Trevor. Sir John is the 66th Lord Mayor of London, and frankly, he's made his fortune largely off of the backs of slaves in the Americas. But that's neither here nor there when it comes to the decorum of the house. The reception room is where you'll be met by two of the servants. One will take your hat and cloak, while the other will show you to the dining room where the meal has already been set. You won't be eating with the Lord Mayor and his family today. They've had their separate chef prepare their meal. While you are in the reception room, you hear the distant sound of screaming children and the clatter of dishes. Your meal arrives. It's a simple affair of mutton, beef, and plum pudding. You eat quickly, eager to see more of the house. Your servant returns and ushers you into the drawing room where the Lord Mayor's daughter, Mary, sits embroidering a cloth. She curtsies when you enter, but she seems distracted and morose. The two maids, watching nearby, exchange uneasy glances. After the drawing room, you are shown to the famous gold bedroom where the walls are covered with fine silk and gold brocade. You notice a hidden door in the wall and ask your servant about it. He tells you that it leads to the secret staircase used by the family to avoid the servants. Sneaky, you continue on to the India room, which is filled with fine porcelain and presents from visiting dignitaries. The centerpiece is a huge Chinese screen which depicts the Chinese zodiac. Next is the library with its collection of law books and historical documents dating back to the Magna Carta. It smells faintly of mildew, and you hope the valuable texts aren't at risk of mold damage. Before you can do anything about it, your servant ushers you into the long room, which is filled with portraits of past Lord Mayors. There are at least 100 and they all seem to look the same. You learn that most of these men had their portraits painted in the same style to save on artistic costs. As you pass through the anteroom, you hear angry shouts coming from the office. You peek in and see the Lord Mayor raging at a young man who stands before him. The Lord Mayor's son, Thomas, is usually a happy-go-lucky sort, but his father's recent death has put him in a foul mood. To make matters worse, he has just received word that his beloved dog, Fuff, has died. He takes out his frustration on the unfortunate servant, who was merely delivering a message. When his father is done with him, Thomas runs out of the room, bumping into you and nearly knocking you over. You both jump, and Thomas immediately apologizes profusely and offers to buy you a new hat to replace the one that is now crushed. You accept his offer and soon find yourself walking through the park with Thomas and his sister, Mary. Thomas is still apologizing for his earlier behavior when suddenly he stops. He says he has to get back to the mansion to take care of business, and you haven't even gotten to see the royal sitting room yet, complete with a wheelchair from the infamous Lord Mayor, Sir Christopher Wren. Mary, however, decides to take advantage of her brother's absence. She discreetly slips a ring onto her finger, one that doesn't belong to her. She has been secretly engaged to a young man for months, but her brother's recent engagement has put an end to that. Thomas would never approve of her suitor, so she has been forced to keep their relationship a secret. She continues to embroider her handkerchief as you leave the mansion and return to your carriage. She may be just a silly young girl, but you can't help but feel sorry for her. As you ride away, you see two men on horseback riding furiously after you. One of them is Thomas, and you know you've stumbled into a dangerous game of love, betrayal, and politics. So what will you do next? Choose wisely. Hey, thanks for watching. Remember to tune in next time to find out what happens next. See you then.